Aloha. I thought it might be useful to provide a real quick introduction, overview of publications and subscriptions in Meteor. I know you've been looking at the guide and reading about it, but maybe another perspective on it will be helpful. The perspective I want to provide starts with saying, well, how do non-Meteor applications deal with data? And at a very simple level, this is the way they do it. You have a server. The server has access to some kind of database. Usually it's a SQL database, but it could be any kind of database. And the clients need to get some of that data somehow. Well, what do? They issue HTTP requests of some sort, encoding some information that the server then processes, and then the server finds whatever the client was requesting in the database, and they return that data as a string to the client. Okay, that's cool. So then what does the client do? Well, the client takes that string and basically builds a local data structure that it uses to provide information to users or do whatever the heck the client wants to do. Okay, but you see there's this kind of transmogrification that's going on. The server has access to a database, but the clients are getting strings, and then they do something new with it. Okay, and that's kind of an implicit assumption of the HTTP request response model in a way, and the cool thing about Meteor is that they rethought this whole idea. I mean, they end up still using HTTP as a transport layer, but they implemented this thing called DDP. I guess they use WebSockets actually, and the notion there is not that the clients will be issuing requests using a select statement or whatever to the server, but instead the Meteor environment, the Meteor framework, one of its functions is to replicate and keep consistent the server database with the client. Okay, so Meteor framework is going to take the database that's constructed on the server and augmented by client interactions, and create replications of it on the client side and keep those two databases consistent. Okay, so there's a lot of black magic and back-end engineering that goes with that, but now you can kind of understand that on the client side is just kind of interacting with the database, and at some conceptual level, it might think it's interacting with the server database, but really not. It's interacting with its own local copy of the database. Okay, and that's kind of cool. It makes life fast in certain ways and more convenient in certain ways. But now the question is, well, we really don't want to replicate the entire server database to every single client. Okay, if you've got some big database on the back end like Amazon or something, that would clearly not be good. Okay, so there's conceptually this looks really cool, but then there's the practical problem of how you actually control this replication process. So just to summarize, in the traditional side, traditional web apps, the client's going to ask for data from the server, usually with something like a select statement. And the HTTP protocol is going to provide that data back to the client as a string. And in order to control the amount of data that the client needs, the client application just uses that select statement to minimize the amount of data to just get the amount of data that it needs. On the Meteor side, we've got a really different paradigm. The server database is going to be replicated to all clients, and so the client simply queries its own local copy of the database to get whatever information it needs. And in order to solve the problem of not having to replicate the entire server database to every single client, Meteor has this new concept of publications and subscriptions. Actually, the concept of publications and subscriptions is not novel. That's a very well-known technology, but they apply it to this problem in kind of a novel way. So what are publications and subscriptions? Publications are constructs that are executed on the server side. And what they do is they define a portion of the database that the server will provide to the client when the client asks for it, and the client's going to ask for it via subscription. And those publications can be, kind of parameterized in various ways. For example, you could say, here's a publication, and any client subscribe to it, and what that publication says is, I will give you only the data that you own, okay, or that you have created, or something like that. And I'll show you how that works in just a second. So publications are server-side constructs that define a portion of the database to be provided to clients. Subscriptions, on the other hand, are executed within a client at the moment where the client says, hey, I need this portion of the database. So and when we use Flow Router in the way we currently use Meteor, we do these subscriptions on a template by template basis. So basically, when you design a template for displaying something in a home page, you ask yourself, do I need any data from the server? And if so, what data would that be? And then figure out what publication, or potentially what multiple publications, are needed to make sure that my local database has the data I need to display this particular template. And I'll show you an example of that in a second. Okay? So whenever a subscription request is executed, that's the moment where Meteor says, oh, okay, now, this subscription request says I need this specific publication. Now I'll go ahead and actually do that replication process. Okay? So the point is that you could have, dozens of publications that you define on the server side, and any particular client may only need one or two. And in fact, whether or not they need any depends upon what pages the user actually requests in the client. Okay? So that's how you really control and in some sense minimize the amount of data that needs to be sent over the wire from the server to the clients. By this publications of subscriptions, publications define all possible slices of the database that can be provided. Subscriptions are the way for the client to say, it's exactly at this point that I know I need this particular slice of the data, so now please give it to me. Here's an example from the digits application number 7, which you can look up as well. The publication up here at the top is saying I'm going to make a publication that's name is contacts, and what this publication does is it says if there is a user ID for this current session that I'm maintaining with a client, if there's a user ID, in other words, if someone is logged in and authenticated themselves with that client, then I'll return exactly the set of documents in this particular collection that have an owner field whose value is the ID of that user. Otherwise, I basically say, nah, there's nothing there. Okay, and this is just kind of Meteor speak for what you do when you're not actually going to return a cursor. You have to return something. You shouldn't return null. What you're supposed to return is this dot ready. Okay, so there's a publication that says I will provide the slice of the database consisting of all elements of or a cursor to all elements of the contacts collection within this database, where the owner field in that each document is equal to the currently logged in user, if there is a logged in user. Okay? Now it turns out in this hypothetical, not hypothetical, but actual running example, in the home page we need to display all the contacts associated with the current user. Okay? And so we do that in two ways. We have a helper function that just says, return a cursor to everything in my contacts collection. Okay? And now you realize, well, that's the local contacts collection. That's not the contacts collection on the server. That's our local copy of it. And then when we create, every time we create this home page, we are going to run a function which subscribes to the contacts publication, okay, which is this guy right here. The publication named contacts, that's defined right here, okay, and that says that if the user is created, if the user has logged in and they're at this home page, then we will return a cursor to this publication will return a cursor to all of the contacts owned by this person. That will result in our local database being updated with all of those documents. So when we do a contacts.find, we'll get exactly those contacts associated with this user. And we wrap it in an auto run so that as things kind of get updated, we'll rerun this subscription, which means, for example, if the same user was logged in multiple clients, they could actually add a contact in one of their clients, and then it would show up on the home page automatically in the other client. So that's kind of cool stuff. Okay, so then there's this thing, AutoPublish. You hear about it a lot when you're a beginner in Meteor, and you probably might be a little bit confused about that, but AutoPublish is really simple. It just basically says that you don't have to write any publications and subscriptions. Instead, Meteor will implicitly write publications and subscriptions to make sure that at all times the server database in its entirety is replicated to the client. Okay? And that's kind of convenient when you're in the initial stages of prototyping and you're not worried about security or the size of the database or anything. You just want to kind of get work done and see things. So you have less code to write. You don't have to specify your publications. You don't have to specify your subscription. So it's a little bit of a time saver at the beginning, but ultimately you have to get rid of it. You have to get rid of it for two reasons. One is that if you keep replicating the entire database to the client, well, one thing is that database, your clients will get slower and slower as the database gets bigger. And secondly, there's privacy issues. Most applications have some kind of authentication, and you like some kinds of data to be private. And publications and subscriptions are the way that you prevent certain kinds of information on the server from being sent to certain kinds of clients. And then finally, it just turns out that with certain packages like Semantic UI, AutoPublish gets in the way of actually making things work. So in my Meteor example form, you'll know that AutoPublish has been removed just to get that example code to work correctly. So that's my little quick introduction to publications and subscriptions. Hopefully that gives you the 30,000-foot level understanding of it. Now to get into the grimy details, you can go read the Meteor guide, and hopefully it will be less confusing to you.